We're joined by Mr. Benjamin Tallis. He's a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Tallis, welcome to TVP World, and thanks for taking the time.
Good morning. A pleasure to be with you.
Good morning, sir. So the AfD, the far right, what many call the far right party in Germany, expects to get 20% of the allocation of seats in the European Parliament that Germany has. In other words, 20 out of 96, thereabouts. Do you think that's a reasonable assessment?
We'll have to wait till polling day to see the exact number, but what's certainly true is that there is a groundswell of support for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, or Alternative for Deutschland, which you're absolutely correct to describe as a far-right party. They feed off discontent within the population in the same way that the far-left parties of Die Linke, or the left as it's called, and the new party formed by Sarah Wagenknecht do.
And now, what are now potential implications for instance, when we are talking about the policies that were introduced thus far, especially the green ones, the climate policies, if I may say so, what are potential implications for them if far-right parties increase their influence, to your mind?
Well, it's still unlikely that far-right parties will form the overall largest bloc in the European Parliament. That's still very much likely to be the European People's Party, the centre-right Christian Democrat grouping. But we can certainly expect to see more far-right MPs in the Parliament overall. The thing is, they won't actually have any kind of blocking minority or a blocking capability, but they will certainly be allowed a voice, and they will put ideas into the debate that will certainly make it more difficult to pass that kind of climate legislation in future, or to propose really far-reaching climate proposals. And of course, they will probably try and clamp down on human rights and on various other things that the EU has been quite keen on in the past.
Right. OK, I'd like to go back to the AfD in particular before talking in general about the far right. Now, many are saying that basically the Merkel-era policy of letting in migrants, and apparently there are more than 3 million refugees and asylum seekers in Germany at the moment, without sufficient vetting, is actually what has led to the popularity of the AfD. Would you agree?
Not really, to be quite honest. I think we also have to look at those numbers quite carefully and think about how many of those numbers that you mentioned right now are actually coming from Ukraine, have been refugees that have been let in the last couple of years in a policy that countries across Europe have agreed with in a time of great humanitarian need when we see the return of full-scale war to the European continent. There are, of course, the refugees and asylum seekers that were let in 2015, 2016, during the Merkel era, as you mentioned. But the question is, why has migration become such a thorny issue? And it's undoubtedly true that it is. The problem is, when we let a lot of people in and our native populations or the domestic population don't feel as though they have a good chance of a hopeful future, migrants become the target for and a scapegoat for what are actually the policies of the government at home and the shortcomings of people's own economic circumstances or the way that they feel their lives are running out of control. And that's been a wider problem that goes far beyond migration. And of course, there are costs of migration, and we have to be able to have a reasonable discussion about that. But there are great benefits to it as well. It's become such a polarized issue that it's very difficult to have that proper discussion. And so migrants end up being scapegoated for what are actually far wider problems in German society, where a good number of people feel as though their country is in decline and they don't see a hopeful future for themselves. If that's the case, then
it's a social issue as well, isn't it, Mr. Tallis? Because it's not just political and economic, it's also about the need. I mean, all countries, to greater or lesser extent, certainly in Europe, do need larger populations. The natural population numbers are going down, national. And so migration in that sense is a good thing, but it's only a good thing if the two groups actually assimilate, work together for the benefit of the country. And would you agree that that is part of the problem? It's not just political and economic?
Well, there's an issue that we have to also deal with migration, that the costs of migration are always upfront, local and personally felt, whereas the benefits of migration tend to be diffuse and felt over the long term by the economy, the society in general. And it's important to note there are not just cultural difficulties to migration, there are also cultural benefits. We can see the different types of food that we can eat, the different kinds of culture that we're exposed to, and the way that actually opens up relations to other parts of the world. But what you're very right to say is that a lot of people feel as though we are not actually sufficiently enforcing our values that we agree on as our societies in Europe, liberal democracies that uphold the law, that uphold the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals, and so on. And they feel as though migrants threaten that on occasion. Now, that's actually a law enforcement problem, and it's a problem of us not being confident enough in our societies and in saying that actually we think these values are better. So I agree there's work to be done there, but I think it's really important to have that balanced conversation. And most of the literature on migration suggests that actually the benefits outweigh the costs over time.
And seeing that situation, well, Europe is an aging society. So now those who are eligible voters now turn more into the values of security and hoping that they will have a secure future in the next 15 years. And having that secure future seems to be on top of the agenda of the majority of the voters in Europe. So do you think that this might be one of the factors why they are turning to the far right parties, seeking now in their agenda some solutions to this problem, or are there any other key factors driving the rise of far right parties?
Well, certainly what the far-right parties offer is not a viable solution for a secure future, nor is it a viable solution for a hopeful future. Many of them propose highly unrealistic measures or seek to simply turn back the clock to a time that never actually existed. There's a lot of nostalgia politics going on. But what I think is driving the rise of both the far right and the far left is discontent with current political elite and the feeling that actually the mainstream parties in Germany, for example, don't have credible solutions to the severe threats that we face and to the severe challenges that we're facing, from the return of war in Europe to economic issues that undermine our competitiveness, that threaten our standards of living, but also in dealing with the climate crisis and mastering the technological revolution that's creating a lot of possibility, but also a lot of fear. And what we don't see is politicians across those mainstream parties having a coherent plan to deal with those in ways that are complementary.
Right. I mean, certainly understood, but there are challenges which green policies, for example, do bring with them, and many countries are having to face those challenges. So far, unsuccessfully, we see farmers protesting across Europe. But zooming out a little bit, with this increase in far-right representatives in the European Parliament, are we seeing a fundamental shift in the composition of the EU decision-making bodies?
No, I don't necessarily think we will, to be honest, because still the Commission will be decided by the groups of leaders who primarily come from the mainstream parties, and the Council will still be made up of those mainstream leading parties. What we'll see is a difference in the discourse. But I think it's important also just to note that a few farmers' protests don't necessarily mean failed green policies. There are, of course, challenges to implementing the green transition, not least our dependence on China for the materials that we need to do it. But we have to actually look at how successful we have been in terms of reducing carbon output in Europe, of creating sustainable energy supplies. And then we have to also understand the costs that are imposed. But we can also see farmers' protests in Poland, for example, at imports of Ukrainian grain. Does that mean our Ukrainian policy has failed? I don't think so.
Thank you so much, sir, for providing your insights and showing us what awaits us now after the elections in June.
Thank you.